All right. Hello and welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good weekend. So, I did want to just point out a couple of things, clarify a couple of things on the syllabus. So, I updated it on the syllabus so that for the packback discussions, they're not due until Sunday nights by 11:59 p.m. And so basically what you'll do, for those of you who haven't gotten on there yet, you pay the $30 fee, you get to kind of create an avatar that looks like you or doesn't look like you, however you want to do it. And then you should be able to see where your peers are posting. A number of people have posted very good questions already, as well as some terrific responses. So what you'll do then is each week you'll come up with a question and respond to two peers. And again, these can cover the lecture material or the readings. Sometimes they'll overlap, but you'll notice the lecture topics become more general about things like, gender and health and so on, whereas, the books are a little bit separate. They talk about those things, but they're kind of focused on different areas in sociology. So just kind of, I wanted to emphasize that. Let's see. So the other thing I wanted to say, for the packback posts, you only have to do it for 10 weeks. So, if you decide you don't want to post this week, you can post next week instead, or just, however it works out. Just make sure that by the end of the course, you have 10 weeks worth of questions and responses. Any questions, and you can just, feel free to contact me. Okay, so where we left off was still digging into the history of sociology, and kind of the historical context in which it occurred. So we kind of call this time period modernity. Modernity refers to generally the post-Enlightenment period, where the powers of modern science were put to use to develop new industries, make new scientific discoveries, come up with all sorts of new technologies, which in a lot of ways revolutionized the world. You also have this increasingly secular view of the world, where science plays a greater role in explaining processes than religion had in the past, which is not to say that, religion started to play less of a role, though that's, clearly true in some areas. In other areas, it goes along hand in hand with modernity. There's all sorts of apps devoted to various religious texts and groups and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, there was this sort of shift that starts to occur in the 17 and 1800s, beginning in Europe and then spreading outward. And that, again, is this, what we think of as modernity, the modern era, and so on. Sorry there, I'm not quite sure what happened, a little technical error. But just saying that, we see this revolution happening in industry, in the capabilities of manufacturing, in distribution, and so on. And this is referred to as the Industrial Revolution. But again, the important point is that there's a view of the world, a social psychology that leads to the Industrial Revolution. And that's really what we call the modern era. So it revolutionizes industry. It also revolutionizes transportation. Until the locomotive was developed, the fastest humans could move would be, as fast as a horse could move. And that, really limits how quickly information can be spread, and people and goods and so on and so forth. So you also get the development of the steamship, which, you're less reliant on the wind, and things like that. And that really dramatically changes international trade, sea trade, and so on. And, for a long time, up until really the late 20th century, a lot of rivers, and for example, in the United States, were very active. They had active port towns and so on. And then over time, semis and other forms of transportation became more efficient than some of the ships that go up and down the rivers. So modernity also changed living conditions. And, we'll talk about this more later in the class, but one of the most important things that have happened in the last few centuries is this increasing migration of people from rural villages, farms, and so on, to cities, moving to cities to work in factories. That was the initial, pull of urban areas. And motorcycle, as I said, revolutions in transportation, such as the motorcycle, and so on. So anyway, going back to the cities, we see this increasing influx of people into urban areas, and that has not stopped. Around the world, this process is still happening, and it has huge implications for the future of us as a species, as well as the future more generally of the planet. So going back to this kind of time period when sociology arises, the late 1800s, in British and in American history, it's often referred to as the Victorian era, because you had Queen Victoria essentially ruling throughout the 1800s, while you have these changes that are happening in the social order. So you still, for at least going into the 1800s and into the 1900s a bit, you still have a powerful aristocratic class that were landowners that, got their titles and wealth through inheritances and so on. But you also have this rise of an increasingly wealthy merchant class that are basically doing trade across the world through the British colonies. So this was also an era of imperialism, of British imperialism. What you often had were in the colonies, such as in this picture, people extracting raw materials, resources, rubber, cotton, all sorts of things like that. Then those get transported to England and to cities such as Manchester and other cities in the northern part of England especially, where you have these new factories. And then you get the development of this group of people who had been farmers and people in villages and so on, craftsmen and whatnot. You get the development of the working class, and it's this new class of people that go to work, at this time it was like 12 hours a day, 6 days a week or something, going to work in the factories. And as we'll talk about later in the class, what's kind of interesting is that this model of work and use of time from the Industrial Revolution, we still use it today. And the way work is still structured, most work, schools, and so on and so forth. And in a lot of ways, I think it's kind of a moribund model, and we should probably update things. And hopefully this aftermath of coronavirus and so on helps to change some of these things, but we'll get there. So it's in this time period where you have changes happening in the social order that the Communist Manifesto is written. So Karl Marx was 25 years old when it was written. So, if you want to write a world-changing manifesto, and beat Karl Marx in terms of, age, you've probably got a few more years left to do that. The one thing why I mention that is this is by far Marx's most popular work. His books on capital and the history of capitalism are much more dense, and you have to kind of read a lot of other stuff in order to, in some ways, figure it out. But there is more mature writing, so they're the writings that he was writing, from his 40s and 50s to his death. And I can say just from the experience of aging is that your ideas in some ways congeal and form over time. And so he didn't necessarily, turn his back on what he had written in the Communist Manifesto, but he goes much further in sort of looking at the dynamics of capitalism. And this is one of the reasons that he's been kind of adopted in, or I should say by sociologists. Not because he was a sociologist or because sociologists are communists, but Marx in many ways was one of the first people to, try to understand causal relationships between the economy, government, the use of land, the use of labor in particular, and so on. So his main argument, and this is actually Adam Smith talked about this quite a bit, is the idea that from all wealth is created through labor. It's called the labor theory. The labor theory of surplus value, or the theory of surplus labor. There are two things there. So Marx's basic argument was that workers will devote a certain amount of time and energy to the work, but there's a certain amount of surplus labor that happens where it goes beyond sort of what they're paid. You can kind of think overtime, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. And the idea here is that wealth then comes out of that sort of surplus value that's created by labor. And whether or not that's an apt description of capitalism in the 1800s or capitalism today is a source of huge debate and discussion that I have sort of mixed feelings about. I think in some ways it captures some aspects of capitalism and labor, in particular, that relationship. But there's a lot of things, as we'll discuss, that Marx missed in his analysis of capitalism. But again, as I said, he was one of the first people to look at how a person's relationship to the economy and what he called the means of production, which would be like factories and machines that are used to develop and make new things. So he says that society is sort of divided amongst these different classes, and that really political power needs to be thought in terms of, who is the ruling class and how do they maintain their power and so on. And so Marx, in a lot of ways, kind of obviously was, taken very dogmatically in the former and in some ways current communist societies. After the fall of the Soviet Union and really the embrace of global capitalism after the 1990s through 2008, Marx became less popular in 2008 when the banking system collapsed, and you had the last major crisis of capitalism beyond, other than what we're experiencing now. A lot of people returned to Marx and, wanted to find whether or not he had things to say that would help us understand the current moment or the current crisis. And again, big source of debate there. But everyone is basically in agreement that the communist attempts of the 20th century just ended in absolute horror and totalitarianism, and so on, especially the Soviet Union and China under Mao. We'll talk about China later, because China in some ways still has some a communist ethos, but they've also embraced a lot of elements of commercial capitalism. As we'll talk about, we're starting to see the Chinese government in some ways try to reinsert more ideas of Marx and socialism with Chinese characteristics, as it's called, into their policies, both domestically and internationally. Moving on, another influential social theorist early on was Herbert Spencer. Now, Herbert Spencer was a British, some kind of an aristocrat, I believe, or kind of coming out of that class. And he focused a lot on the rise of the nation state, modern government, and what that meant for individual freedoms, individual liberty. He was a strong follower and believer in social Darwinism. So Darwin had, just recently published and promulgated the theory of evolution and the scientific observations that he had made regarding evolution and natural selection in particular. Darwin was not the first person to think of evolution. I mean, that actually goes all the way back to Aristotle, knowing that there's this evolution over time. However, what Darwin did, though, is, that revolutionized our understanding of evolution, was this idea of natural selection. That's, society, evolution favors certain traits in species, and that, individual members of a species with those traits are more likely to perhaps pass on their genes, and so on and so forth. So Herbert Spencer and others were strong believers in this new science, and they thought that, well, if they could apply it to, say, butterflies or birds and things like that, then perhaps you could apply the same thing to humans. And so social Darwinism was this perspective of the late 1800s and early 1900s. It's still sometimes, it's still actually quite popular, even though it has been, just absolutely destroyed by modern evolutionary biology, as well as evolutionary psychology, which is focused looking at human psychology from an evolutionary perspective. Other thing I want to mention about Herbert Spencer, a lot of people, I'm sure most of you have heard the term survival of the fittest. That's an idea of, kind of explaining natural selection. A lot of you probably think it was Darwin who said that, and I did for quite some time, but it was actually Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer is the one who used who made up the term survival of the fittest. So anyway, just kind of something you can quiz your peers about, and they'll probably think it was Darwin too until you tell them that it was actually Herbert Spencer. So another, as I said, going back to Herbert Spencer and the social Darwinists. So they build this theory of evolution, of human evolution, and not surprisingly, they placed Europeans on top, white Europeans, and basically everyone else is on a pyramid downward. Again, as we'll talk about later, when we talk about sociobiology, it's those views, that sort of social Darwinism, it just doesn't make any sense in terms of understanding actual evolutionary human biology and psychology, which is far more nuanced and complicated than a lot of people realize. But as I said, we shall get there. So we've already met Durkheim. Durkheim, discussed the theory of anomy, where he was worried about social, the breakdown of social norms and values and so on. Durkheim considered himself a sociologist and spent considerable amount of time trying to develop the discipline, trying to make it a science like psychology, which was more or less developed at the same time. And so he set out to kind of study what he called social facts, and that to try and study these things scientifically. So social facts would be things like religion, or the economy, or a sexual relationship, or whatever it might be. It becomes a social fact, and then you can study it from different perspectives or using different methods. And we'll talk about research methods on Thursday. So he's often also called a functionalist. I'll go into that a little bit more later. But this was a school of thought in sociology that, still exists today, where, society is kind of viewed like the body of an organism, where different social institutions are like different parts of the body. So, the education system is the brain, the economy is the heart, whatever it might be. And so the idea here being that all these different institutions need to function well, and if one of them suffers, then it could lead to sickness in the rest of the social body. So everyone in the early days of sociology was interested in the Romans because it was the most, in many ways, technically advanced society in Europe before the rise of modernity. And so it was a long-lasting society and empire and so on. And so it provides a lot of interesting information about how society is structured and so on. So Marx was interested in, the ruling class in Rome and the Roman Empire and how they maintained their power. Durkheim was, as a functionalist, more interested in how the system kind of held together. So he asked why the patricians, the ruling class, the plebeians, kind of like the middle class, and the slaves, how they maintained this, this sort of social hierarchy for so long. Interesting thing, and we'll again talk about this in more detail later, but slaves in ancient Rome it wasn't like slavery that Europe and the United States practiced. Slaves were often integrated into society after a certain amount of time, were granted freedom. They could then run for office and stuff like this. So it was kind of a different system. Slavery nonetheless. I mean, when you were a slave, you had to do what you were told. So anyway, again, Durkheim, I think, has a lot of interesting questions that are relevant for today and some of the stuff that we see happening around the world. So looking at some of the questions, he wanted to know what the consequences were of this complex division of labor. So if you remember from the last lecture, Adam Smith talked about the free market and how people that are acting out of their own self-interest to, gain a little bit more profit for themselves and their family, that you have everyone doing that, and it kind of creates this harmonious equilibrium. And so this is about 150 years later, almost 200 years later, that Durkheim is kind of looking at this now well-developed capitalist system that Adam Smith was kind of theorizing about earlier on. So Durkheim, writing 200 years later, has noticed that, you have this huge division of labor that develops, where people are doing all sorts of different tasks. Some people are working in factories that are making wheels for wagons. Others are working in factories for to make clothing. And then you have the trade relationships that bring in the cotton and the other raw materials, and so on and so forth. So he was very interested in that system, the division of labor, as well as religion, which we'll talk about later on. He was also kind of like Herbert Spencer. He was interested in the role of the individual and freedom in this, quickly developing modern state that was, collecting information on its citizens and so on and so forth. And so he wondered how you could have individual autonomy or liberty while at the same time being subjected to the regulation and discipline of the broader social order. In other words, how could social bonds be maintained and reinforced without submitting the individual to repressive institutions? Durkheim died all these guys died before the rise of Nazism, and so it would have been interesting to see, what they would have thought about it in relation to some of their theories at this time. So as I said already, Durkheim was a functionalist, and that was a dominant and still is fairly dominant perspective in sociology. It's kind of metaphorical, like I said, as it says here, in the same way that the skin holds together the human body, so too do norms and values bind society together. And so functionalists are, from a normative perspective, they're interested in order, stability, how you maintain moral consensus. You may want to know this stuff for an exam or something in the future. So whenever you hear something about, moral consensus in terms of looking at the society sociologically, usually that's, coming from a functionalist perspective. So again, Durkheim kind of starts this perspective. He wrote a lot about morals, morality, and as I said, religion as well. And so what he finds is he's trying to figure out what binds society together, and basically finds that it's two things. And they can be, together or separate. One is shared moral purpose, like, everyone's has the same religion. And secondly, a division of labor, where everyone is taking part in this broad global capitalist system, doing, various different jobs, but it all kind of aggregates into the system, the capitalist system, which, tends to need some sort of, some stability in order for the system, supply and demand and commodity chains to work, as we're all learning more about during these COVID times. So again, as I said, this slide I showed earlier, but just kind of a reminder, Durkheim was worried that this division of labor and democracy, where you have people given more choice, more chances to pursue their own individuality wherever that takes them. He was in favor of capitalism and democracy, but he also felt that they had the potential to really destabilize society. So there can be a breakdown in the social order when when the society is in a state of anomy. Remember, it's not anarchy, there's not chaos and just absolute breakdown, but you do start to see society breaking down because people are having disagreements on what the norms should be, what the society's values should be, and so on. And that's why I think, anomy is a good way to understand what's happening in many parts of the world today. And then you could say that some places, perhaps like Afghanistan or something, are in a state of true anarchy. But what we really see, especially in the capitalist countries today, the wealthier countries, is this state of anomy where there's a lot of disagreement on a whole range of things, different values regarding religion, the environment, race, ethnicity, all of these different things. Gender, that's a big one. And we'll get more into these. As I said, so he kind of thought that we would most likely see this happening in industrial societies. So Durkheim developed two descriptions. Sorry, I got a piece of hair in my mouth. Okay. Two sort of descriptions for how societies are kept together. And he refers to it as a type of solidarity. There's mechanical solidarity and organic solidarity. And it's kind of the opposite of the way you might think it. So mechanical solidarity actually refers to sort of a pre-mechanical era, or at least pre-industrial societies, where these are generally smaller societies, hunting and gathering societies, pastoralists, farmers that have cattle and so on, where you have the social power structure happens through these political relationships between families. So throughout a lot of human history, marriage was not about love and connection and that sort of thing that we think of it today, not about romance, but was about, the alliance of families and the strengthening of certain clans and familial groups. And so that is how society was kind of structured. He calls it mechanical solidarity because these societies don't change rapidly like you see in modern industrial societies. Say you grow up in a hunting-gathering society, you're a woman, chances are that you will be what you will be doing when you grow up. You'll be gathering berries. You will be cooking food and helping maintain huts and various things like that. You will have a child of your own, or actually children, who will help with your family, and so on. So we call this mechanical solidarity because it was almost kind of like mechanical, where people would what people would do. They would just kind of mechanically follow the generation before them in terms of their occupations, their religions, and so on. Another key thing that would help hold these societies together was shared religion, shared myths, shared magic practices, things like that. And so the tribe then is basically the society. It is the society that these people live in. So again, there's also a lot of totemism. And here, these are literal totem poles, but totem being an object, any sort of object that is valued as a religious or magical object by a certain tribe. And so Durkheim did a lot of work looking at Aboriginal tribes in Australia and some of their religious and magical practices. And he was very fascinated by, the dances that people would engage in and sort of lose themselves and their individuality into this, this ritual. And other social psychologists have, kind of built on that to talk about modern raves and clubbing and stuff like that, where people, it's kind of a similar thing going on. People are losing themselves, in the music, in the moment, that sort of thing. But there was this other part where, where objects were seen as being, alive and sentient, magical, having magical properties. It's actually kind of fascinating. One of the oldest objects that archaeologists are aware of, that they have in their possession, is not like a tool of some sort. It's actually it was something they found. Archaeologists were able to determine that it was used for magical or religious reasons. And to me, that's very fascinating, because it means that, if true, it means that these humans, that these primates here, were already thinking about, the existence, essentially, in a sort of philosophical, theological way, and were, making objects and using totems before they were, making wheels and stuff like that. So anyway, kind of interesting from the perspective of evolutionary psychology. So that's mechanical solidarity. This is organic solidarity. And, from the perspective of how we use those words now, it seems like it should be, switched around. So there should be organic solidarity for these tribes that were in a pre-industrial society, and then mechanical for the industrial society. But remember, it's about where people ended up in the system. So he calls organic solidarity this type of society that developed, especially in Europe, and was already to some degree already in existence in China and parts of India and so on. But anyway, the key feature here then is that what binds society together now is not, custom and tradition or religion, shared religious belief, but rather contracts. Whether these contracts are, a rental contract, a paycheck, all of these things, are held together by different contracts. And so he says that he calls this society organic because if you, just to kind of stick to the gender of the last example, in a mechanical society of mechanical solidarity, you kind of follow your parents or other people around you in terms of what you do with your life and your time. In these societies that are characterized by organic solidarity, it's more organic. You sort of recognize certain skills that you may have in high school, where maybe your father was a baker or something like that, but turns out you're really good at quantum physics or something like that, and so you decide to go off to MIT instead of going to work as a baker. Very simple example, but organic solidarity then is what he believes holds most of the modern capitalist world together. And remember, he's writing in the early 1900s, late 1800s, and I think this applies even more so to today's relationships with capitalism being so global, and our various contracts between different countries, between different companies and countries, and so on and so forth. And we're also seeing, what happens when a pandemic hits societies that are characterized by organic solidarity, and we're starting to see how tenuous some of those commodity chains are. So again, the solidarity here is it's not because people have the same set of beliefs as was the case in the past, but rather because of the functional interdependence that we find in the division of labor. So, if just to kind of think about today, So there are people across right now, especially in East Asia for the last couple of decades, few decades, who have worked in, enormous factories, making everything from everything to everything. And then, selling it on the world market and so on. And so in a lot of ways, the links between, say, China and the United States are we're very much, our economies and societies are very entwined right now. And so, threats to those relationships, say, if China decided they didn't want Apple to manufacture in their country anymore, that would have huge effects for the global organic solidarity of this capitalist system. Apple would have to, quickly find a new place to go, and so on. At the same time, that would be a big blow to China because China has a lot of interest and investments, both personal and capital and so on, in Apple. So again, I think that's just a good example of the functional interdependence that we see between countries and economies today. Another key thing, organic solidarity, beyond just that sort of functional interdependence, we also see that the way individuals, their beliefs and actions in some ways don't matter as much for organic solidarity. And, if you had a small tribe and everybody believes a certain myth and they pray to the same set of gods who are going to supply them with, good harvest next year and so on. If some individual in this small, agricultural tribe says, I don't know if there's a god of harvest. I think that there's only one god, or I think there are no gods, or whatever it might be. Well, they wouldn't be in that society for very long. They would either be there would be a sort of intervention, or perhaps they'd be banished, or perhaps even killed. So mechanical solidarity really depended upon a common belief system. Organic solidarity does not. So in addition to not, if your father was a baker and you don't want to be one, in addition to that not following in your family's footsteps and so on, you could also have a completely different belief system. Say they were Catholic or something like that, Catholic Christians, and you were, kind of decide you wanted to be a Buddhist or something. You're free to do that, and there's not going to be any sanction against you. No social, maybe some social personal sanctions, but there won't be any legal political sanctions against you. So again, organic solidarity actually presupposes these differences, that, people are going to be related to each other through the economy before, it comes through culture or something like this. So, most Americans and most people in China have not necessarily realized how, how tightly interconnected they are with people in each respective place. So Weber and Durkheim, there's Weber, there's Durkheim. As I said, they talked about a lot of things. I'm going to get to Weber. So these are two. Durkheim kind of tries to develop sociology into more of a science. Weber kind of does the same thing, but looking at it from a more broader historical perspective. Durkheim, as we talked about, did the first study of suicide. He also did a few other empirical studies. Weber, who, is popular enough to show up on a tagged wall in somewhere in Germany. Weber kind of, in some ways, was like Marx in that he was interested in capitalism, interested in the government, more so than Durkheim was. But he viewed it in a very different way than Marx did. He thought Marx was too simplistic, too reductionist, reduced everything to an economic relationship. Weber saw the importance of things like culture, religious belief systems, ethnicity. He was married to one of the early feminists in Germany at the time, and he actually sat on the PhD committee of the first woman to get her PhD in Germany. But I don't think he did much writing on gender issues, or I don't think he did any, actually, or at least none that were focused specifically on that. What he did do was look at some of the same things that Durkheim was looking at, these changes that were happening in society at the time, the modernity, the modern era. the development of the Industrial Revolution, political government and administration is becoming much more standardized, draws upon science more, that sort of thing. And so he's noting this change from, what Durkheim would call mechanical to, what he would call organic solidarity. But Weber's looking at things a little bit differently and focusing on certain practices in more detail. So he was very interested in rational calculation, how people who ran industries or political agencies and so on, how they got their data and what they did with it, and how they used it to develop, how they use it to create more efficient ways of doing things, and control, bureaucracy, basically. And, we think of bureaucracy today and we think of slow-moving government agencies that are, very inert and so on. But Weber said, kind of recognized that, but he also said they replaced the patrimonial relationships where people just, become powerful based upon who they know. So as I say here, bureaucracies, these are organizations that are found both in the public, in government, but we also see them in companies, corporations, that sort of thing. You often have the bureau in private office, which is usually called the office or something like that. So Durkheim did a lot of work in that area. He also had this thing that he called the iron cage of rationality, meaning that in this new modern era, you have this kind of set plan of rational choices to make, that you make throughout your life to get to the next step, to, do well, you study for these exams so you can place highly and get into a good college. And once you've done that, then you do all these other things to build up your resume, because it's a cold, cutthroat capitalist world out there, the world of work, and you want to do what you can to have your resume stand out and so on. And so Weber is saying that, everyone is doing this and they're, becoming more professional and so on. But in some ways they may be encaging themselves in their own rationality, because they don't, stop and smell the flower, so to speak, but stop to appreciate, the wonder of life itself, the, kind of the amazing aspects of your own reality, and, the one life that we know we have, and so on. He said that this sort of wonder and creativity was being sort of crushed by this new, or I should say, encaged by this new system of based on rationality. And, it's arguable whether, human creativity has suffered or been enhanced by this system. Certainly, I think, as we'll discuss, many aspects of human creativity are, I think, encaged. And, the fact that it takes a pandemic for us to start thinking about, well, maybe we could redesign the world of work. It doesn't necessarily have to be this 8-to-5 thing, and so on. So that's, we're starting to get out of some of those iron cages. The other area where he's very important and influential is in the study of religion. So, excuse me. So if you take social theory, one of the books you may end up reading is The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And here he makes this argument. Well, first he asks this question, why is it that so many modern capitalists were Protestants? And so he's looking at the new capitalist system that's developing, and he also knows there have been merchants in Islamic societies and Hindu and so on. He's wondering, but why didn't they really stick to this? Why weren't they the ones to develop this capitalist ethic that's really based where everything kind of becomes subsumed in this market system? So he's kind of curious about why that is. And he basically argues that, well, a lot of it is tied up with the Protestant work ethic. So in Protestantism at this time, it wasn't, people didn't know whether or not they were going to go to heaven or hell. But in this idea called predestination, there was this idea that God already knew whether or not people were going to heaven or hell, but people didn't know that. And so people thought, they wanted to have, some way to gauge whether or not they were doing things well, to, they're getting closer to heaven, not hell, that sort of thing. And so they came up with this idea of predestination, and also that your life, your material life here, reflected whether or not you were going to heaven or hell. So if you're doing well here on earth, then that must mean that as long as you were a Christian, that must mean that you were bound to go to heaven. And so if you're doing really well and you're a Christian, you had a clean shot at getting to heaven. In some ways, it just kind of, to me, it sounds like a way in which to justify unequal systems, unequal social systems, which it probably was, because it's not really taken too seriously anymore. Although there still are sects in Christian theology that still believe this. But so again, that led everyone to work hard because they wanted to be successful. And if they were successful, that meant that they were, more likely to go to heaven. So so Weber kind of pointed out that this Protestant work ethic went very well with this, capitalist work ethic, that they sort of melded quite well. Weber also had a lot of influence in the development of early political science and political sociology. One of his most important phrases or sentences is that modern government, or the state, is the organization that has the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence within a given territory. Meaning, the key here is legitimate, meaning that most of the people, citizens, recognize that this group that's able to enact violence, that they have the right to do so to protect the country, to protect the society, or to enforce the laws. Doesn't mean that everyone thinks they're legitimate, but for the most part, the government is seen as being legitimate if they're using, violence for those reasons. Now, the kind of key thing here too is that if you learned about the government in high school, you may have gotten a different definition. I think this is probably the most accurate definition, because if you think about it in this way, and historically you have one group that calls themselves the government, and they're busy legislating and making new laws about how tax dollars should fund road construction or whatever it is. And then you've got another group that's got more guns. And it doesn't take long before the group with more guns becomes the government, as we have kind of just seen in the last few weeks with the Taliban in Afghanistan. Just kind of forget about America. As America's leaving, you're starting to see the government has less guns, essentially, than the Taliban. And so the Taliban, they have more guns, they are more violent, and so on. And so they swept the country very quickly. And now they've taken over government. And evidently they're already having some problems because they don't know how to govern. They don't know how to make some of these decisions for, the distribution of goods and some of these things. And so anyway, we're watching this kind of play out in a very unfortunate way in Afghanistan. But you could see that over time, if the Taliban can't govern, the people might get sick of them, and you may see another group of angry citizens with guns who may displace the current Taliban government. So those were the big three kind of classic sociologists, Marx, Weber, Durkheim. They didn't really get into kind of two of the main topics of sociology today, gender and race, ethnicity. So they were talking about these big social systems. We often call it macro sociology, like capitalism, religion, government, and so on. Writing in the late 1800s, early 1900s, kind of the same time as Durkheim and them, Harriet Martineau was this scholar, and she was an activist in France who basically introduced sociology to England. So she was reading Marx and Durkheim, and saying, yes, this is all very good. This is was good attempts at understanding society, but she kind of noticed that over half the human race was missing. There wasn't really a whole lot about raising children. There wasn't really a whole lot about marriage and coupling and some of these things. So she begins to emphasize, the role of women's lives in sociology. She also began to look at things like divorce and marriage and children and race relations to a greater extent than Marx, Weber, or Durkheim did. Kind of along those same lines, so there were a lot of in the early sociologists, as I said, didn't really talk about race too much, and a lot of them were white, and they were European, and they were male, and so on. So W.E.B. Du Bois, and he has it pronounced Du Bois, Du Bois, not the Du Bois, as it would be pronounced in French. He went by the sort of Americanized version of Du Bois. So Du Bois was the first major African-American sociologist. And he was the first African-American to get their PhD at Harvard, and he has, did a number of other things. He did a lot of research on early demography and criminology, which just happens to be what Penn State's programs, our sociology program really excels in, especially the graduate program in demography. So Du Bois was an activist and a scholar. He did a lot of work for, fighting segregation in the American South. He argued against the social Darwinism that people like Herbert Spencer had promulgated. And he ended up moving to Ghana later on in life, and actually he was becoming more and more radical as he got older, to the point where he was essentially a communist in his later years when he was in Ghana. And he died 1 year before Martin Luther King's speech, "I Have a Dream," and so he kind of missed out on some of the big changes that were going to happen in the next decade for race relations in the United States. He missed the Voting Rights Act and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, the assassinations, the Black Panthers, all of these different things. So, he just died a decade too soon, because one wonders what he would have thought about the really dramatic changes that happened in the next few years after his death. So one of his big concepts that I think has been very influential for sociology is what he calls the double consciousness. And he was referring to African Americans in particular at that time, but it can really apply to any minority in a society, where the member of the minority, they have to, be familiar with the customs and traditions and everything of the majority, with their history, even though it's different, certain traditions that may be different, but they have to be sort of aware of them to, function in that society. But then they also have this sort of consciousness that comes from their minority status and their minority culture, where you may have some of the same values and practices of the majority society, but you may also have some different ones. You may have different foods, different recipes, maybe different religion, things like that. And so Du Bois calls this double consciousness. And he says, I'll just read this. He says, "It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity." And kind of go on with it. Starting here, "One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder." And so, people have obviously built on this, and, we have probably more than just double consciousness. There are multiple consciousness, says, some of this kind of goes into intersectionality, the approach that looks at how these different aspects of our identity intersect to make us who we are, and also in some cases to oppress who we are. So, other things that he did that, are very relevant for today. He did a lot of research and a lot of mapping, and I think that's kind of cool because I took some GIS classes, the Geographic Information Systems, which kind of underlies Google and a lot of online mapping and so on. And so this is, back in the late 1800s where he is, already creating these maps looking at, this is the African American population in Georgia, but he would kind of break it down even from there, looking at incomes and, whole range of really interesting things. And a book has recently been published that looks at it's a book of his, all these different charts and maps and graphs that he wrote. What I like about him as someone who teaches, he was experimenting with ways of presenting data, and trying to find these effective ways of conveying these certain numbers and statistics that he wanted to show, which there's obviously huge in sociology and the sciences today. If you can graph something, that's much better and more intuitively understandable than if you're just reading about numbers and statistics in a textbook or an article or whatever it might be. So here he's got this percentage of the population that were free and African American versus those that were slaves. And so these free ones obviously are in the North, not in the South. And so roughly you've got only about 10 at the most 13% of the population of the African American is free from the 1790s up until 1865, I believe, when slavery was ended. And then you see all of a sudden it goes down to almost nothing, and it's arguable. There are still probably people that are kept as slaves, but for the most part, most people are free. Of course, they're then subjected to all these segregationist policies in the South. But again, it's just kind of a dramatic way to show that it's a really small number and a huge number of African Americans. I think that's the bigger point that he was trying to point out, that, you have this huge percentage of African Americans that were slaves, and then the law changes and all of a sudden they're free. So anyway, as I said, kind of a cool way. I like some of his stuff because I like presenting data, and he had some interesting experiments with that. Okay, so I do want to mention that in the modules today, along with the slides for this lecture, there's short little videos on each of these thinkers. Each of them I think is like 5 to 10 minutes. They're animated. They're good. I would suggest watching them, but they're not required. So anyway, have a good week. Continue or start reading Connected and Neo-Feudalism. Hopefully you'll start getting the books or have received them already. On Thursday in lecture, I will go over some aspects of research methods, as well as kind of introduce you to Connected, go over some of the kind of fundamentals of social networks, social network analysis, and that should be a good introduction. So anyway, have a good week, and I will see you on Thursday.